Okay, so, sorry. Testing the seals of recently lapped valves. There are a couple of methods to doing this, and I've actually employed two methods. The first is the light method. The light method, of course I'm not going to show you here because it wouldn't show up on camera anyways, is to basically get in a completely pitch black room, all the lights off, get you a flashlight that can reasonably fit into the exhaust ports or the intake ports, shine the light up in there, and obviously with the light off, go around the valve, and you're going to want to get at an angle and kind of loop around, because if you're looking at it just straight on, you're not going to see any of that light escaping around the edge of the valve. You're going to want to get at the exact angle that essentially the valve seat is ground to, and you'll essentially discover that by just kind of moving around and checking at all angles all the way 360 degrees around. I suggest doing this with unlapped valves to begin with, so you can see what you're looking for. It's going to be tiny, tiny pinholes of light. But even after you lap the valves, you might come across a couple of teeny, tiny pinholes and think, oh God, well, I still need to lap these valves. Well, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, the fact is that, especially if you just have the valves just sitting down in there under gravity pressure, that there's probably going to be a couple of pinholes of light. And what I did, and these were very well lapped valves, they were actually lapped with lapping compound, which actually begins at I think like 220 grit or something. It ends at 180. Don't quote me on that, I can't remember. I just know that it has 2 levels of grit in it, and that as you start to grind the valve, the larger particles, just by the natural pressure and angle of the valve, start to move out of the way. They start to move to the outside, and the smaller particles are left doing the finer grinding by the end, when it's all said and done, by the end of it. But I still chose to use, this is a really old, but it still works, fine valve lapping compound. You almost can't even find this stuff online anymore. I think this is actually Clover brand, although it's missing the label. I looked up online, and Clover is pretty much the only brand that comes in this little metal container. But I actually used that after regular valve grinding compound, and then after that I used heavy duty rubbing compound to polish them out. But other than the light test, which, like I was saying, even if you see a little light coming through after you've ground the valve, try applying some pressure to it and then doing the same check. Keeping the flashlight in there and, going, oh, sorry, it's probably making you sick to watch this. But I'm just trying to give you an example of the angles. You need to go 360 degrees around the valve with, just the pressure of your fingers. Because the pressure of these valve springs is a hell of a lot more than what you're just going to be able to apply with a couple of fingers. But these valves are lapped so well that even with just the light pressure of a couple of fingers, pushing on them, I could not see a single pinhole of light. They appeared to be essentially light tight, which is, I guess, watertight for light. And apparently light, I remember reading on some message boards, and I don't know how scientific this is, but light can fit through much, much smaller, essentially micron-sized holes that water and other fluids can't fit through. But so I did the light test, but just to be sure, after I installed the valve springs, I decided to do the water test as well. This is the 2ZZ GE head. There's some other videos out there of people doing the same test, and essentially they used some sort of putty to fill in the spark plug holes Fortunately, the 2ZZ is threaded all the way into the head. So all you have to do is simply flip over the spark plug, and I used a little bit of Teflon tape on the threads of the spark plug just to make sure it was watertight. Might not have been necessary, but just to be safe. And did the water test here, which, essentially taking a syringe or, just a dropper or something, or even just lightly pouring the water down in there. Most of the videos I've seen of people doing this use a syringe so that they can measure how many cc's go into the head, wait several hours, if not overnight, come back, and then draw the water out and measure if the amount of cc's is the same. Well, I see some problems with that. It's never going to be the same. You're not going to be able to draw out all of the water that you put into these heads. Some of that water just from surface tension, and it's just going to stick around the edge of the valves. It's going to be, at best, you're going to be able to measure within, a few cc's of what you put in there. So I essentially said, that's kind of pointless. So what I chose to do was to fill these heads up, essentially overfill them. As you can see, that water's going a little bit over the edge there. So surface tension is essentially what's holding the water in there. You can see the water just kind of bent around the spark plug as well. But surface tension is essentially what's keeping that water from just completely sliding over the edge. And this water actually has a little bit less surface tension than pure water because I mixed it as about 50, well, maybe more like 30-40% isopropyl rubbing alcohol, just because it's naturally going to clean the inside of the combustion chamber, as well as serve the purpose of eliminating some of the surface tension of the water. Put pure water in there, and pure water is going to have a lot of surface tension. It's not going to be that great of a tester of how much the valves seal, because the surface tension will just keep that water from leaking through there naturally. But add some surfactant such as soap to the water. It's going to help break that surface tension, or in this case I've used rubbing alcohol. It's going to help break that surface tension so that that water is more likely to leak through any imperfections around the valve and the valve seat. So another common test that people do on these is the acetone test, which acetone has pretty much zero surface tension. It's pretty much going to go through any tiny little hole. Well, not any, because even acetone at some level has a limitation of what it can go through. Apparently light is the ultimate test, because light is one photon thick. It can fit through very tiny holes. The problem is the inability of the human eye to detect low light. Although when your eyes are adjusted to the darkness, especially if you don't look directly at the edge of the valve seat, if you look a little bit off to the side, I believe it's the cones in your eyes that detect light, and there are actually more cones in your peripheral vision than there are in your retina or whatever. This is why if you actually look up at the sky at night, you will see more very faint stars out of the edge of your vision, or just out of the center of your vision, not directly in the center of your vision, than you will see looking straight on at something. And that's actually a scientific fact. You can look that up. Your not necessarily your utter peripheral, like the side of your eye, but say I'm trying to look for light escaping from this here valve here. If you're looking in the dark, look here to where it's just out of direct vision, because that part of your eye is going to have a lot more cones that pick up faint sources of light. But anyways, back to this water test. You see there's actually a bit of a oil floating on the top of it, so it kind of looks gross. But the reason I've got this cylinder, I guess the number 4, the number 2 cylinder filled up right now, is just so if I did have any leaking come through. Okay, and obviously the reason I have these up on books like this is the spark plug tubes extend out beyond the bottom of the head, so I can't set it flat on a flat surface. You would need to put it on a sawhorses, and most 4 cylinders are designed like that these days, or just books that I've used here. And you want to make sure that those are essentially level, that you find books or shims or whatever you're going to use that are pretty much exactly the same height on each side, so you don't have the water kind of sloshing off to one side or the other. But anyways, last night I tested this cylinder, and this cylinder put that solution in there for I think it was about 8 hours, and got 0 leakage. But because there is a decent amount of rubbing alcohol in there, and obviously, like I was saying, I did not suck the water out and test it. I basically just paid attention to, at the end of that 8 hours, number 1, is that surface tension remaining? Does it still look like that water is being held in by surface tension? It's going to look a little bit less like the water is bent from surface tension than it does right now, because both water and alcohol are volatile, and there's going to be a slight amount of evaporation, more so from the alcohol than from the water. And you could do just a straight water test, and some people do that, and it's a valid test. But so expect that see, as much as that water is bent right there, and you see it is actually spilling slightly over the edge, but not quite into these oil drain holes here. So it essentially stopped. So I overfilled it until it started to flow out. Then I stopped so that I could just observe the surface tension and see how much it dropped over time. Over a course of about 8 hours, it's going to drop just almost barely perceptibly, almost imperceptibly. But another thing to do at the end of that time is to, take your flashlight and just look up in the, of course that's not showing up well on camera. Look up in there, see if you see any water dripping down. Feel up in there with your finger up and around the valve. See if you get even a slight bit of moisture on your finger, and then that means that valve probably isn't completely sealed. Not that these things need to be 100% sealed to serve their purpose. I've read so much about people putting in new valves and not lapping them at all, even on a used engine head, and it'll probably get you by, but you're going to be losing power over time, and anywhere that those imperfections exist, that blow by is going to make those little pits and little areas worse and worse. You're going to have more carbon built up on the valves themselves, and that's going to cause a poorer and poorer seal over time. So my objective essentially was to get these perfectly sealed, as sealed as you can get, essentially without taking them to a machine shop. And from what I can see so far, I think I've accomplished that. I mean, this has been a couple hours since I filled up these remaining 2 cylinders, and they're essentially exactly the same as when I first filled them up. So, that's just a little walkthrough of what I've done with this head. I'm by no means an expert. This is the first engine I've ever built, and it's a learning process, but these methods have worked for me. If you're building a similar engine, especially if you're building a 2ZZ, I would suggest doing the same. These are stainless valves, so this water's not going to cause any rusting or anything. Stainless doesn't rust, so you don't have to worry about that. And that is essentially it. So let me know what you think.